So this question is about the brain and the sense organs in relation to the new model as such. So if I just outline what I understand as the new model, I think we've talked about it before and you've said it this week, but it's that consciousness is the biggest thing within mind, within matter. Within that is matter. And that can be represented by deep sleep, dreaming, and the waking state. And it could also be knowing, which then, as you say, kind of vibrates within itself to produce experiencing, being in the mind, and then that, through thought and perception, produces the duality of the experiencer and the experienced. And so within the consciousness there's timeless, dimensionless. Within mind there's one dimension of time, and then that then proliferates itself to time and space, and therefore the notion of cause and effect as well.
Yes.
So, because it seems like there's a kind of tenacious belief which is loosened greatly, and I don't think I believe it anymore, that thoughts and the brain, that thoughts are produced by the brain. But it seems that the brain is really only an object of perception in the waking state. It's just an object in the waking state. Like we can only ever think of, it's kind of hard to describe. The brain is an image which is a perception, but if we actually go to, therefore, our experience of that can be reduced down to perceiving, and then the perceiving can be reduced down to knowing. Yes, am I making any sense? And the same goes with the other sense organs as well, like the organ of the eye as well. We normally think we see with the eye, but
Sorry, go on.
So yeah, that I think.
Go back to Mary and Jane. Yeah, Mary falls asleep. She dreams that she's in Burlingame. She dreams that she's Jane on the streets of London. So the streets of London are what the inside of Mary's mind looks like from Jane's point of view. Yeah. So in fact, the streets of London are they appear from Jane's point of view as matter, but in fact they are the inside of Jane's mind. Inside of Mary's mind. Sorry. Could it be that our brains are what the inside of our minds look like when viewed from a second-person perspective? Just as the world is what God's mind looks like when viewed from the point of view of a second-person perspective, could it be that our brain is what the inside of a finite mind looks like when viewed from a second-person perspective?
It could be.
In other words, just as the streets of London are the extrinsic image of Mary's intrinsic experience, could our brains be the extrinsic view of could our brains be what our intrinsic experience looks like from the perspective of somebody else? In other words, from somebody else's perspective, our mind looks like an object made out of matter, just as from our point of view, God's mind looks like a world made out of matter. And that would account for the fact that there is obviously a direct correlation between our minds and our brains. I don't deny that. Change the mind, it registers on a brain scan. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that the brain causes the mind. But there is a connection between the two. Why? Because the brain is what the mind looks like when viewed from the outside. You taste chocolate. Yeah, imagine the taste of chocolate.
Yeah.
And you're having a brain scan. Now the brain surgeon registers you tasting chocolate, but what he sees is something very different from the taste of chocolate.
Yeah.
You experience the taste of chocolate from the inside. He sees your brain waves moving from the outside. So the taste of chocolate is what you experience from the inside. And that, from the surgeon's point of view, it looks like brain waves from the outside. So there is a correlation between the taste of chocolate and your brain waves, but that doesn't mean that your brain waves create your experience.
It's just two different ways of describing the same thing.
It's a first-person point of view, that's our internal experience, and a second-person point of view. Just as the world is our point of view, a second-person point of view of God's first-person experience. So this is all the inside of God's mind. When filtered through the limitations of our minds, it appears as a multiplicity and diversity of objects. So the world is what the inside of God's mind looks like from a second-person point of view. Could our brains be what the inside of our minds look like from the second-person point of view? Why not?
And then with the other sense organs, would that be the same representation? It would be the same explanation, I guess, like seeing the first person point of view's perception, but the second person's point of view is the eyes which are perceiving.
Exactly, yes. Yes,
and
you could put it like that.
And that's the same for ears and taste and smells.
Yes.
And touch as well. And I guess the whole body in a sense.
Just like going back to Mary and Jane. Jane believes that she sees the world through her eyes, or she perceives experience through her eyes and her ears and her nose and her mouth. But those organs, they from the inside, from Mary's point of view, Mary doesn't have eyes, ears, nose, and a mouth. She seems to know the inside of her mind through the sense organs of Jane. So for Jane's point of view, it seems that her eyes are doing the seeing and her ears are doing the hearing. But it's not really like that, because it's a Mary asleep in Burlingame that's really doing the seeing and the hearing, and she doesn't have eyes and ears. But from Jane's point of view, it seems that she has eyes and ears, and that the eyes are doing the seeing and the ears are doing the hearing and the nose is doing the smelling.
And I guess that kind of goes for all the organs of the body and the body itself.
Yes. It's just a model. It's not I'm not suggesting it's a completely accurate description of experience, but it explains how there is a correlation between the mind and the brain without implying that the brain produces the mind. It's acknowledging the correlation between the two, but it stops short of saying the brain therefore produces the mind.
And so from the first person, sorry, just because this is kind of interesting. So from the first person perspective, everything is that there's just, is that when there's just seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, thinking, sensing, that's the first person perspective. And the second person perspective is what that looks like from an outside observer.
Yes.
So the first person perspective, if you actually stick with it, is that the experience of, that's mind, that's just all mind stuff, I guess, that's all experiencing. There's no But from the second person perspective,
it looks like matter.
it looks like matter.
Yes, so from the first person what is made of mind from the first person perspective looks like matter from the second person perspective.
And is that
what is all the inside of Mary's mind looks like matter from the point of view of Jane. From Jane's perspective, the world seems to be made out of matter. From Mary's perspective, it is all mind.
Yes. And that's...
So matter is what mind looks like when viewed from a limited point of view. You get that? Matter is what mind looks like from a limited point of view. God's face, the world, is what God's face looks like when viewed from the perspective of a separate subject of experience. In other words, all this is God's mind, but it appears to be a world made out of matter when viewed from a finite subject, from the point of view of a finite subject. When God's mind is filtered through the limitations of a finite subject, it appears as a multiplicity and diversity of objects. Remember Shakespeare. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And as God's infinite being bodies forth its own dimensionless presence, a poet's pen, that is the finite mind, turns it into form and gives airy nothing, God's infinite being, a name and a form, and makes it appear as a world. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And as God's infinite being bodies forth its own dimensionless presence, each finite mind turns that presence into objects and forms and gives to God's infinite being a temporary name and form. Shakespeare is very much more eloquent than I am.
And then, so then the exercise that we've done before, when there's an object, so say for example the flowers, That's the second person perspective. That can then be turned into the first. I'm not sure of this. This can then be turned into the first person perspective, which is really just seeing, and then that in itself can then get reduced down to knowing. And in the same way, the flowers or the brain are the second person. Is that?
Yes, the flowers are your second person perspective of the activity of God's mind. From God's point of view, this is the activity of her mind. From your perspective,
Yes.
it is a bunch of flowers. However, the experience of seeing is the activity of your mind, but from a surgeon's point of view, it looks like brainwaves in your skull.
Yes. I think that makes sense. Because the second person perspective is always a
Second
reduced
person
object.
perspective makes mind look like matter.
Yes, yeah.
From the first person perspective, it's all mind.
It's all mind.
From a second person perspective, that activity of mind appears as matter.
And then would you say that, so the first person perspective, that's still not quite consciousness's perspective as such, because consciousness's perspective is just all knowing.
That's
that's
true.
already
That's true.
So it's kind of
Don't
person.
make me work too hard.
Zero person perspective, first person perspective, second person.
You're right. You're right. Yes, yeah. But the zero person perspective, that's dimensionless consciousness in which there is no form. Yes.
And that's kind of like the deep sleep. The first person's like the mind, it's all mind, so the dream, and then the second person is the matter, so it's like the waking.
Yes, you could put it like that.
But
yes.
it's all really all
Exactly.
consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
Just vibrating within itself.
Yes, and remember that it is dimensionless consciousness, that's the zero person perspective, who itself assumes the form of both the first person perspective and experiences everything as mind, and then within mind enters into its own imagination to seem to become a second person point of view, from whose perspective its own mind appears as the world. It's a beautiful model, isn't it?
It's lovely.
It's exquisite. It's like a jewel. It's like a jewel within a jewel within a jewel, isn't it?
Yeah, it's lovely.
It's a jewel in which every part is related to every other part. Every part is reflecting off every other part and appearing depending on where you're taking your point of view. It's like a fluid jewel within a jewel within a jewel.
And what seems like it seems to be able to take account of both the materialist and the idealist points of view.
Absolutely. The materialist point of view is the second person point of view. The idealist point of view is the first person point of view, and the consciousness only model is the zero point of view, which encompasses both the others, but is beyond both of them.
Yeah, it's good that.
And another way of saying it, which is just, this is for something you to think about in the early hours, and actually you touched on it, the zero, the consciousness, from the pure consciousness's point of view, pure consciousness has no dimensions. The mind only has a single dimension, it only has an extension in time but not space. And from the second point of view, second person point of view, space seems to come into existence. So something that is zero, has zero dimensions, takes the form of something with one dimension, which in time takes the form of something that has three dimensions. So first there is dimensionless consciousness, then time, then space. That's your homework, ponder that.
Thank you.